Isaac and his brother Henry sat with their mounted poles and watched as their slacked lines bobbed up and down in the water. They were both tired of fish, but they were both very hungry. The sun can take a lot out of you, especially on open waters. They'd only been out at sea for a week, but it felt like much longer to them. Their father sat at the boat's helm and pushed the wheel a little as he looked down at a map. A seagull landed on the edge of the ship. Isaac and Henry both looked up at him, and then at each other. They ran to their father, cheering. "You weren't going to tell us?" Isaac exclaimed. "Yeah, when were you going to say something?" Henry asked with joy. Their father chuckled and said, "I thought it better a surprise to the two of you. You're not saying you don't want to be out here, are you?" Isaac and Henry stopped cheering and tried to put on serious faces. "This has just been a small taste of what it's like out here," their father said. He leaned toward them and stroked his black and gray speckled beard. "Long days, the rations of food and hard work. It's what you boys wanted, ain't it? A sailor's life." Isaac and Henry looked at each other and then back at their father. The seagull cried out, and a wave broke on the hull of the boat. "It is what we wanted," Isaac began. "But it's just, well... You miss gallivanting about with your friends, don't you?" their father asked. "Have to say I'm proud of you two for not wringing each other's necks out here. I've seen lesser men fight each other in less time than this." Henry smiled at Isaac and playfully slugged him in the arm. "How long till we make landfall?" Isaac asked. Their father looked down at his map again, shielding his eyes from the setting sun. "Wind keeps up and water stays calm like this, we'll be making our delivery sometime tomorrow afternoon." Isaac and Henry cheered again. Their father quieted them. "I don't want you two thinking it's always this easy. I let you come out here on this trip to get a grip of what it's like. We've been blessed with clear sailing and gracious luck, but that ain't always the course. Sometimes the sea turns for the worst and chews you up." He stared off at the horizon for a moment. The sun glistened in his deep, brown eyes. Isaac and Henry wondered what he was pondering. He'd been on the sea for most of his life, and they could only imagine the things he'd seen. Over the years, he'd shared tales, some taller than others, but all adventurous and wild. They were thankful that he was willing to give them a taste of the open waters and a glimpse into the life of a sailor. "I mean no offense," Isaac said, "but it's been pretty, boring, honestly. Another day of tightening ropes and maintaining the ship, and I probably would have—" His father cut him off. "Don't you curse us like that, lad. There's worse things out here than choppy waters and dark skies. We're lucky to have had it this easy, and lucky to have been making landfall so swiftly. Don't mistake the sea's kindness for boredom." Henry slugged Isaac a little harder than before. "Let him be," their father said. "Your mother would have been proud of both of you. I'm proud of both of you. You both got smarts that surpass some men that's been living 4 times your age." Isaac and Henry felt proud of themselves. They looked at each other and smiled. "You get that from her, not me," their father said. He tapped the wooden lower half of his leg and continued. "Believe me, I've done crazier things than most and somehow lived to tell the tales. Feels like a lifetime ago these days. The sea felt much younger, and the air had a sweetness to it." He looked off at the horizon again. "Tonight we can tap into our rations," he said, "and eat to our heart's content. We'll restock everything tomorrow." This was the best news Isaac and Henry had heard the entire trip. They were both at an age where hunger was constant and food was more precious than gold. That night, they sat below deck at a small wooden table. A dangling lantern flickered across their feast. Their father knew how long the trip would be, but he had played as though it would be longer than it was. He wanted to give them a sense of what it was like to have things in short supply and only eat what you need. His sons passed the test. Isaac stuffed a biscuit and a wedge of cheese into his mouth. The ship creaked, and the lantern overhead swayed a bit as the ship gently rocked. Henry spoke up with a mouthful of dried salted beef and cheese. "It's cruel what you done to us, making us think we had to ration out our food a lot longer than we did." "Cruel?" their father said. "What's cruel is having you think you can eat as much as you want out here. I was teaching a lesson to the two of you. Did I ever tell you the story of the voyage I was on where—" Henry cut him off. Yeah, you've told the story where you and your mates were trapped at sea and started thinking about eating each other. You've told it on several occasions. Well, their father said, then you should be well aware of the importance of rationing your food. Too many days without it out here, and Isaac would have been looking awful tasty. Their father laughed and took a swig from a glass bottle. How come we can't have none of that? Henry asked. Their father corked the bottle and sat it on the table. That? He said. Trust me, you don't want that. Who says I don't? Henry asked. Their father eyed him for a moment, then slid the bottle across the table. The ship rocked in Henry's direction and the bottle slid faster than he anticipated. It slid off the table and Henry caught it just before it hit the floor. He looked up at his father. His arms were crossed and he tipped his head back, giving Henry the go-ahead to try it. Isaac ripped off another bite of jerky and watched as Henry uncorked the bottle. Henry looked at the two of them and squinted his eyes. Then he tipped the bottle back. He immediately spat out the liquid that flowed into his mouth. His father erupted with laughter, slapping the table. Wasting the rations, boy, he shouted, then continued to laugh. Henry jammed a biscuit into his mouth and passed the bottle to Isaac. Isaac sniffed at the opening of the bottle and shook his head in disgust. He corked it and slid it back to their father. His laughter settled, and he took another swig. Ah, let that be your next lesson, he said. This stuff is a double-edged sword. Liquid courage on occasion, but rotten poison for the most part. Moderation, lads. He got up and stowed the bottle in a nearby satchel hanging from a hook. Henry was the first to go to sleep. Henry was always the first to go to sleep. Isaac sat at their table, passing his finger through the flame of a candle that sat in a mounted holder. Their boat rocked gently with the waves, and the low groans of creaking wood sang softly in the night. Isaac's father, whom Isaac assumed was asleep, gripped his shoulder from behind. Isaac jumped, and his father chuckled. No ghosts on this ship, lad. Just a one-legged old man. He sat, and for a moment they were silent. I know this wasn't the tidal wave of adventure you wanted, his father said, but those days will come. You'll get your sea legs in time, and things will come at you faster than you can handle. Believe me. They did for me. I let the wind into my sails and the sun on my face for a long time. He looked down at the table, and Isaac saw remorse on his face. I done things I ain't proud of, too. Things I regret. Desperation and being shackled to a dastardly crew marred my soul, he said. This was a side of his father that Isaac had never seen. A darker side. Isaac wondered if his father had been loosened up by the extra rations of whatever was in his corked bottle. I put my anchor down when you and your brother were born, though, he continued. The open waters kept calling, but I couldn't keep giving the sea the time I used to. Hauling these deliveries kept food on the table, kept me home. They probably saved my soul from darkness I didn't even realize was creeping in. A snore from Henry echoed through the room and mingled with the ship's low groans. I got out, Isaac's father continued. Some don't make it out, but I got out. He stared into the darkness around them. The candle flickered and cast long shadows on the walls. Those shadows danced with the moonlight that shone down the ship's open hatch. I've told you a lot of stories, he continued, but I ain't told you everything. I reckon the lessons you need don't lie in some of those tales anyway. He stared into Isaac's deep blue eyes. The flame of the candle was reflecting in them. There's something I need to give you, Isaac, his father said as he stood slowly. He walked to a chest that sat at the end of his bed. Then he took a key that was strung around his neck and opened the chest. When he returned to the table, his hands were clasped around an object. Isaac could see a faint red light emanating from between his father's fingers. This safe passage has been no coincidence, Isaac, he whispered, nor has the safety of the countless voyages I've taken in years past. We've been blessed by the heart of Gaia. He opened his hands, and a beautiful red light filled the room. Isaac looked at the gem sitting in his father's palms. Teal and purple swirled within it, and it undulated like the scales of a bioluminescent deep-sea creature. It was alive, breathing, bound only by the strands of vibrant silver that surrounded it. Isaac could hear it inside of his head, calling to him. His eyes were fixed on it. A pure sense of bliss and awe filled him. The red light swirled like a whirlpool all around them, and streams of gold tendrils began to sprout from its center. The edges of the gem began to liquefy, and Isaac watched as mossy veins of green plant life unwound from it. A sprawling network of geometric shapes unfolded in front of them. They were covered in coral, algae, and barnacles. Innumerable fish swam among them. Isaac reached out with wonder. He moved his hand closer to the gem, but just before he touched it, his father slipped it into a tan leather pouch and pulled the drawstring. The flickering candle and the pale moonlight were the only lights that remained. Isaac had heard of the heart of Gaia, a legend told by sailors, a treasure sought after by pirates, or those brave enough to traverse the perils procuring it entailed. It was a relic, mentioned in stories much larger than any Isaac's father had ever shared from his past. Isaac didn't need to ask if it was real. He could sense it in his soul. The pouch his father put it in was strung onto a thick leather cord that made a necklace. He pulled the cord over Isaac's head and onto his neck. Then he leaned down, face to face with Isaac. "The pure of heart will use it to do great things," he said, "just as the darkest men would use it for their most vile desires." Isaac fumbled with his words. "Thank you," he finally managed to say. His father leaned back in his chair. "I stole it," he said, flatly. Isaac stared at him, confused. His father continued. "Not from anyone who would have used it for any good, believe me. It holds power beyond this world. The men I took it from, they would have done terrible things with it." Isaac grabbed the pouch around his neck and said, Then they'll be looking for it. What if they find it? You, me, us." "The heart doesn't want to be found by those with dark souls," his father replied. "Its very essence, its nature, is pure. I haven't used it for riches, fame, or luxuries. I do hold it at night sometimes and wish good things upon the sea, for us and for others. I protect the heart, and I believe it's been protecting us." Isaac thought for a moment, and then asked, "How'd the men you stole it from find it in the first place, if they're so bad?" His father looked up and out of the hatch at the cloud-framed moon. He took a deep breath. "That tale's for another night, Isaac," he said. "I don't plan on leaving you with 1,000 questions, lad. I know you already know what it is, from the songs and the tales. There's no easy way to drop a weight like this on a young man. But I won't be around forever, and I think you're the one to keep it now. Tomorrow, when we make landfall, I'll send Henry on an errand, one that'll take some time, and we can talk more about this. Even then, I'll be needing more than just one afternoon to spin the whole tale. For now, get some sleep. Lots of work tomorrow." Isaac sat awake in his bed, holding the pouch in his hand. He could hear it whispering softly, a chorus of waves and angelic tones in his head. So many thoughts churned in his mind. So many questions. He'd just been given something out of a fairy tale, something more ancient and magical than anything he could ever have hoped to possess. His excitement and wonder were mixed with something else. Fear. As much of a blessing as the gem was to receive, he also felt its weight. The responsibility of keeping it safe. Safe from things he didn't know or yet understood. His father had assured him that the heart warded off those who meant to take it for nefarious purposes, but Isaac wondered how long it would do so. Darkness had taken it before. How long would it be before it found it again? He thought. The heart soothed his mind. It quieted his racing thoughts, and soon, with the gentle swaying of their ship, Isaac drifted off to sleep. In his dreams, he was on the deck of their ship. White-tipped waves were speckled all around him. The ship felt different, though. There was something off about it. It felt old to him, and as he looked around he watched dark green moss and plant life spring from the wood all around him. He called out for Henry and his father. No one answered. All he could hear were the waves crashing against the boat and seagulls squawking. The seagulls got louder and louder, and Isaac watched as they swarmed down toward the helm of the ship. He walked carefully over the newly sprouted plant life to the helm. There were dozens of seagulls swarming over something, pecking at it. A white cloud of wings and beaks feasting upon something. Isaac moved toward the seagulls slowly, trying to see what they were eating. As he got closer, he gasped and ran toward the mound on the ground. It was his father. The seagulls scattered, flying in all different directions, and Isaac was left staring at a terrible sight. His father was being consumed by the oceanic plants that were taking over the ship. Strands of green ivy wrapped around his limbs, and his body was melting into the boards of the deck. Pulsating algae and seagrass grew around his arms, legs, and torso. Anemones were springing from holes in his skin. His flesh was turning green and purple, and his eyes were glassy white orbs. Isaac knelt and tried to pull the slippery plant life off of him, but it was no use. It was consuming him. Each hole the seagulls had plucked into him was oozing briny ocean water. His father opened his mouth and frothy sea foam poured out. "Father!" Isaac cried out. The sky around him went dark. A black seagull swooped down and landed on his father's chest. Its head twitched in an unnatural way as it turned to look at him. It let out a cry that rang out in Isaac's head like a blast from a rifle. The cry knocked him to his back and onto the deck of the ship. He tried to pull himself up, but vines were already winding their way around his arms and legs, pulling him down as he struggled. He cried out as the moss and algae spread throughout his body. The black seagull landed on his chest and looked into his eyes. It let out another cry that was more intense and painful than the first. It slammed into Isaac like a cannonball, rattling his brain and blurring his vision. Again it cried, and again Isaac felt its weight as it dug its talons into his chest. He screamed, and the seagull shook his mind with another cry. It was a deep thoom. He could hear splitting wood. Salty ocean water was rising through the porous wood beneath him. The seagull approached his face and reared its head back. Just as it sprang forward to peck at him, he woke up. Another thoom reverberated in his head, followed by splitting wood and rushing water. This time, though, he wasn't dreaming. A cannonball slammed into the side of their ship, sending large fragments of wood and debris everywhere. Henry and his father both sprang awake and jumped to their feet. They were already ankle-deep in cold ocean water. "Get to the deck! Stay low and stay behind me!" their father shouted. Isaac and Henry followed him up and out of the hatch onto the deck. It felt cold, and clouds rushed past the moon, creating an ominous flicker of light. "What's happening?" Henry shouted. Their father rushed to the helm and picked up a bronze spyglass. He extended it and looked out across the water. The sea looked black, and ripples of strobing moonlight speckled the water. Then he saw it. The very ship and crew he'd been avoiding for many years. The ship was close to them, but seemed to reflect no light at all, a dark silhouette against a pale backdrop. Their father pulled the spyglass away from his eyes slowly and looked down at his sons. "They're after our cargo," Henry yelled. His father sighed and shook his head slowly. He looked at Isaac gravely and said, "I wish they were." Then he looked back at the ship. His father hadn't told him much, but Isaac knew enough to know that they were the men looking for the heart of Gaia. He pulled the pouch from his neck and quickly tucked it into a compartment in his boot meant for coins and small treasures. The sound of another thoom filled the air, and the three of them braced themselves. They heard the cannonball whiz overhead and watched as the tallest mast snapped and began to topple. "Move to the bow!" their father shouted. Henry lunged forward, racing to the front of the ship. Isaac looked up at his father and knew that with his wooden leg, he wouldn't make it out of the way of the falling mast before it landed on him. He ran up the short set of stairs to the helm and jumped toward his father, pulling both of them out of the way just before the mast smashed into them. Isaac laid on his back, breathing heavily. The fall had knocked the wind out of him. Everything was a blur, and for a slow moment, a patch of stars revealed itself between the clouds above. Time snapped back to normal, and Isaac saw a curious shadow forming in the sky, something he couldn't quite identify. It was getting larger, very quickly. A fist-sized hunk of wood from the shattered mast fell onto his head before he could realize what was happening. He awoke to the stench of putrid rot. His head reeled with pain, and he could feel dried, crusty blood on the side of his face. When he opened his eyes, it looked as though he was surrounded by a dense fog. After shaking his head and blinking vigorously, his vision cleared. His father and brother were like him, on their knees, wrists, arms, and legs bound by several ropes. The boards of the deck beneath them were black and rotten. An overgrowth of dark green and black moss and algae seemed to be consuming portions of the ship they were on. Lanterns were strung up with black ropes. The flames inside of them were like no flames Isaac had ever seen before. They created light, but the flames themselves were deep purple, outlined with solid white. Isaac heard a clunking sound from above. He looked up and saw bones strung through more black ropes, swaying in the wind. Some were from large fish. Others were human. He also heard the buzzing of flies, no doubt feasting on the unseen rot that was accosting his nostrils. Henry and his father were in a daze, barely conscious enough to keep themselves from falling over. Isaac nudged Henry with his elbow. "Hey, wake up!" Henry pulled his tired eyes out of the stupor he was in and squinted at Isaac. "I don't feel well," he whispered, looking as though he were moments from vomiting. In the dim light, Isaac noticed a large bruise blossoming on the side of his face. He must have been smacked by a piece of wood, too, he thought. Just then, a tentacle shot out of the water below and wrapped itself around the wooden banister that lined the perimeter of the deck. Isaac and Henry both looked in terror, imagining what sort of creature was about to board the ship. The end of the tentacle had red, glowing eyes, and a mouth like an eel. They heard a bubbling shriek and watched as a form jumped onto the deck. The eel tentacle recoiled like a snake up the armhole of the emerging figure's jacket. He had used it as a grappling hook and hoisted himself aboard. The head of the eel poked out of the armhole and hissed at them. Isaac and Henry were shocked and confused by the man the eel was connected to. A green light flickered beneath the translucent skin on his chest, and veins of glowing green spread across him like tributaries flowing to the sea. He had large, piercing yellow eyes that moved independently from one another. They glowed brightly and illuminated the rest of his malformed features. Barnacles and oceanic plant life were sprinkled across one side of his face. The other side had gills like a fish that opened and closed as he breathed. His rotten, tattered hair and beard floated about him as though he were underwater. Slimy bits of decaying sea life were woven throughout it, along with beads, bones, and bits of glimmering gold. His large teeth were sharp and white, and the green glow he held within him could be seen behind them as he smiled. His attire, although tattered and decayed, gave Isaac and Henry the impression that he was the captain of the ship they were on. He wore a long black jacket adorned with rusted and corroded treasures. The thick leather belt strung around his shoulder was clasped together with teeth and bones. A long sheathed sword hung at his side, and 2 pistols were strapped loosely to his waist with several strands of rotten seaweed. His boots thunked on the deck as he walked toward Isaac, Henry, and their father. The eel's eyes were locked on them as it hissed again and snapped its jaw several times. Other forms began to climb onto the ship behind the captain, abominations that sprung from nightmares beneath the waves, twisted human forms wrapped in the snarling depths of the sea's madness. They were each an amalgamation of sea creatures in decay, sickeningly fused with what was once human. Isaac's father stirred from the twilight. "We don't have it," he shouted. "Even if we did, what makes you think we'd give it to you?" The captain approached and leaned down face to face with Isaac. Isaac noticed tiny white worms wiggling from some of the captain's pores. The eel slithered up to Isaac's cheek as the captain's smile stretched higher on his face. Isaac felt the eel's tongue dance along his cheek. He closed his eyes. Maybe it's a dream, he thought. Maybe my father never gave me the heart. Maybe all of this is in my head. "Hey, leave him be!" Henry shouted. The captain and his eel turned to him. He walked over and looked down at Henry. His smile faded, and the lights in his eyes turned red and intensified. They were torches in the night. Then he spoke. "Perhaps you know where it is. What we seek. It wasn't on your ship, lad, and your father would have undoubtedly used it to save you by now, if he possessed it." Henry spat at him. The captain laughed and pulled one of his pistols from his waist. "No!" their father shouted. The captain pulled the pistol into the air and brought it down on Henry's head. He fell off his knees to the deck. Their father shouted again, "You sack of worms, I'll break every bone in your body." He squirmed and struggled against the ropes that bound him. The captain looked at him and smiled. "You know what we seek." The words slithered from his throat. "Tell us where the heart of Gaia is, and I won't kill your sons. I may even keep you as a pet." He bent and ran a cold skeletal finger along their father's face. The eel popped up and began to slide along his other cheek. "You got away from us," the captain said. "A fish that strayed from the school. A lost shipmate gone astray. Won't you come home?" Their father spat this time, right into the captain's face. "Never," he said. The captain stood. Then he quickly unsheathed his sword and pointed it at their father's neck. "Wait!" Isaac shouted. His father turned to him and shook his head. "No, boy," he said. "I know where it is," Isaac said. His father lowered his head and sighed. The captain's head snapped back at Isaac. "Do you, lad?" he asked, with a perverse sense of wonder. He sheathed his sword, pulled out the pistol he'd smacked Henry with, and took aim at his brother's stomach. "Tell me," he barked, "or I put lead in your brother's guts." "What's stopping you from killing us after I tell you?" Isaac asked. "You need us alive. You don't have a thread to pull if you kill us." The captain smirked at him. I'm heartless, he whispered. Then he sneered and barked. I don't need all of you. Throw 'em over, he shouted. His eel of an arm hissed. One of the crew members, who was more crab than man, scuttled over and hoisted Isaac into the air, upside down. His claw-like appendages pinched the ropes that bound his legs. Isaac thrashed and yelled, and his father shouted for the creature to let his son go. Just as quickly and easily as he'd been picked up, he was flung into the air and over the edge of the ship. He splashed into the cold ocean water below. Pale webs of moonlight shone through the surface as he struggled against the ropes. The breath he'd taken as he fell was running out. His lungs were starting to burn, and he could feel water beginning to slip into his nostrils and down his throat. He couldn't help but think of how his father was wrong. He thought of how the people who wanted the heart of Gaia had found them, and how the heart hadn't protected them from anything. He wondered if it was going to sit idly by as he slowly drowned. Then he felt something warm in his boot. It felt like a fire had been ignited. A red light shot up his leg and pulsed through his entire body. Suddenly, he could breathe. It was the strangest sensation Isaac had ever felt. Water was rushing into his lungs, but he could breathe it, like oxygen. He calmed himself, taking several deep breaths. He was able to breathe, but he was still falling deeper and deeper into the abyss. He looked up at the bottom of the ship he'd been thrown from. It was becoming a distant speck, bobbing in the waves above. Isaac started to feel the weight of the ocean around him, the pressure of the endless depths he was falling into. Then, off in the distance, he saw a light. It was very faint at first, but it got bigger and brighter very quickly. As it got closer, he realized that there were many lights flickering in fast succession. Vibrant purples, greens, and pinks were strobing across some creature he couldn't see in the dark waters. Isaac was struck by its beauty, but he was also terrified by the speed at which it was swimming toward him. It got closer and closer, until it was upon him. Swimming away wasn't an option, and struggling was useless. His eyes widened at the massive, gaping maw of the creature, and then it consumed him. He sloshed into the thing's mouth. The act of being swallowed was chaotic for Isaac, especially since he had no way to brace himself or stabilize his body in the rushing water. He heard a deep, echoing hum as he washed onto a spongy surface, like a piece of driftwood settling on the shoreline. He was breathing air again, and he wondered how long it would be before the creature started to digest him. Isaac rolled onto his back and tried to see anything, but it was pitch black. The tongue of the creature was slippery, but he managed to pull himself to his knees. He felt the creature shift as it swam, a fast-paced version of what it felt like to be on a ship. Then he heard something, a soft, metallic sound in the darkness. "Who's there?" he whispered. He felt something quickly cut the ropes on his legs, arms, and wrists. His first instinct was to try and run. But to where and why? He thought. Anyone willing to cut me free surely had no intention of harming me. He wasn't sure which direction to turn in the darkness to thank the person who had freed him. Again, he saw faint lights appear. Only this time, they were right in front of him, and not attached to something trying to eat him, or so he'd hoped. Glowing teal dots appeared, and slowly a dark, soft face emerged, framed by light. Then 2 dazzling, beautiful eyes opened. They glowed with the same teal color on her face, only brighter. Strands of light fell from the top of her head and cascaded around her. Veins of light stretched from the figure's chest in a similar way that light had from the captain's, but less jagged and with delicate swirls. They reached out to every inch of her figure. She was the only light in the darkness that consumed them. A gentle, floating form in the void. She whispered to Isaac, softly, "You hold the heart of Gaia." Thank you so much for listening to this story. It's only part one of a story that I'm anticipating to have several more parts, at least two more parts, potentially three more parts. I've got a plot and this world that I've built inside of my mind, and I'm going to let it unfold over the course of these next few episodes. This one's a little more in the fantasy realm. It's sort of a fantasy horror fusion, so I hope that you're enjoying that aspect of it. For whatever reason, it's just really fun to write things in a nautical setting. There's a lot to work with the animal life and plant life and just the beauty and darkness, the fusion of the two things you can have in like an oceanic setting is really cool to me. So this one's been particularly fun and super interesting and engaging for me to write. Stay tuned because the second part, not the final part, but the second part will be out very soon. There are several ways you can support the podcast. The first of which is just telling your friends and family about it, sending them a link, maybe sharing a story with them, telling them why you like the podcast. The second way is leaving a rating or review or a comment or a like on whatever streaming platform you're listening on, Spotify, Apple Music, YouTube. They all have their different way of leaving a review or comment. So doing that really helps this podcast become more visible. The last way you can support is by joining my Patreon at patreon.com/strangewhispers. You get exclusive content over there, early access to episodes, and a plethora of other things. However you support, thank you, thank you, thank you. I am extremely excited to share the next part of this story with you all, so stay tuned. And until then, keep creating.